All right, welcome to today's session for Black History Month. What's going on? Black home ownership crisis. Today we have Deborah Biddle with us, and she's going to help us explore and learn practical ways to combat housing discrimination, especially with Black home ownership. So, Deborah Biddle is a certified diversity professional coach, workshop presenter, educator, and experienced business leader. She strengthens organizations by helping individuals and leaders at all levels to understand and move toward a more inclusive environment. And she does this through consulting, one-on-one leadership, coaching, leading DEI workshops, and by providing thorough organizational assessments. She's very involved in her community, very involved in global DEI efforts, and I'm so happy that she's here with us today. So, Deborah Biddle, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Liz, and welcome everybody. I'm excited to get into this very important topic. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can jump right in. So as Liz said, the topic for today is what's going on, the Black home ownership crisis. So today we're going to cover what the crisis is. We're going to talk about the crisis in particular in Washington State. We'll talk about some of the ways that Black home ownership has been addressed in terms of the crisis. And from a Black person's perspective, with Black resistance being the Black History Month theme this year, we'll talk about some home ownership crisis strategies. So Liz Mineo is a Harvard staff writer, and she said that the wealth gap between Black and white Americans has been persistent and extreme. And if you know anything about the history of economics in the United States, you will know that it actually is one of the most critical factors in terms of passing down wealth from generation to generation. But the accumulated effects of 4 centuries worth of institutional and systemic racism is the most portion of this issue that has responsibility for the disparities in income, health, and education and opportunity that continue and persist to this day. In addition to that, others who have studied this work, including Professor Alexandra Kilwald from Harvard University, says that today's African American adults and children are living with that legacy of discrimination and exclusion from slavery and redlining and other discriminatory practices that have left us in a situation where we are, instead of passing on generational wealth, we have generational poverty, and white Americans have benefited from this legacy of advantage. So what is going on? What is the Black home ownership crisis? The fact is that there are persistent disparities that exist in home ownership rates between Black and white Americans that have been around basically since Black people have entered the country. And instead of getting better, we'll see as we go on today, it's actually gotten worse. So my question for you is, what do you think the difference is between white home ownership and Black home ownership in America? So I'll ask you to type into the chat what your answer is. Is it A, 25%, 40%? Is it 30% or 45%? So type your answer into the chat and I'll take a look and see what we're coming up with. We've got kind of all over the map, but looks like majority of folks are leaning towards D. And that's a good guess, but the actual answer is that the home ownership rate for Black Americans nationwide is about 30% lower than whites, larger than it was in 1968 when housing discrimination was actually legal. So that's huge. And the gap is really tied to this issue of the racial wealth gap, which has been, like I said, passed down from generation to generation. And what we're seeing in the economy is that there's this rising trend of inequality that is persistent in communities of color. So in Washington state, we see that the homeownership rate for Black Americans is about 27% lower than white Americans. So you're a little bit better than the national average. So I'm going to move on to talk about, sorry about that, the Professor Susan Wachter. She's from the Wharton School of Business. She says that homeownership is the main component of wealth for most households. And it actually does explain most of the difference in wealth if you think about the various segments of the population. If you know your U.S. history, you know that things like the GI Bill that was intended to benefit all military people was used as a way to discriminate, so that white GIs were using the bill to be able to purchase homes, but Black and other Americans of color were not able to take advantage of that. You know about redlining and all the other discriminatory practices, and that further caused this degradation in home ownership and wealth in communities of color. If you want to look more currently, we look at the Great Recession. We know that Black homeowners have been the slowest group to recover from that time, and their home ownership rate has decreased below the pre-crisis levels. So if you look from 2005 to 2009, there were 3 million homes that were foreclosed on during that period of the Great Recession. And of that, Black homeowners have been slowest to recover. Professor Arthur A. Colin from University of Washington in Seattle says that Black and Hispanic households, for them, there was an increase in home ownership from 1989 to 2005. But again, with that period of the Great Recession, the decrease was so much more that it wiped out the increase. So instead of, because of all the advances where we've seen more people of color go to college, we've seen more people of color move into higher paying jobs. But as we'll talk about in a few minutes, there are other factors that have actually caused a degradation in the amount of home ownership in Black and Hispanic households, which is kind of contrary to what you might think based on the progress that various segments of our culture have made. So there's been progress in education, but not so much progress when it comes to wealth building. So, question for you to put into your chat, the answer: how home ownership is higher for Black college graduates than for white high school dropouts. True or false? Give you a couple more seconds. It looks like there's a pretty good split with the majority going with false. And that is correct. It is false. Home ownership is lower for Black college graduates than for white dropouts. In fact, although the home ownership rates increase as educational attainment increases for both Black and white Americans, white high school dropouts have 60.5% of home ownership in terms of its rate, compared with only 56.4% for Black college graduates. Again, that speaks to this whole issue of wealth. So student loan debt is one of the major contributors to the growing gap between Black and white home ownership. So as we are seeing more college graduates in the Black community, they're graduating with a significantly higher rate of student loan debt. And as a result of this debt and not having the generational wealth, Black Americans with a college degree are 5 times more likely to default on student loans than white Americans, which then causes them to have the inability to get a not a student loan, but a mortgage loan, because they may have bad credit as a result of having defaulted on student loans. When it comes to borrowing and credit standards, Black borrowers are less likely to meet the traditional credit standards to qualify for a mortgage loan because they have lower FICO scores, and part of that is related to the high student debt burden, which widens the home ownership gap. So they're less likely to meet the mortgage lending credit standards. So that's another big piece of why you will see fewer Black people qualifying for mortgage loans. Another piece to think about is that despite progress, Black people are still faced with a lot of barriers when it comes to discrimination in housing practices and in lending practices. And there's just less access to affordable housing. When it comes to the coronavirus pandemic, we saw a disproportionate impact when it came to Black people related to housing insecurity, in addition to all of the other economic factors of insecurity. COVID-19 led to more job loss, it was wage reductions, and the housing insecurity, which made it difficult for people to save for down payments, which then in turn made it more difficult to secure funding, which resulted in less people buying homes. Additionally, we still are faced with some of the repercussions of systemic racism that relates back to historical redlining practices that really has concentrated Black communities in certain neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods being under-resourced and underfunded. On top of that, we see that there have been systemic racism in the housing markets that were caused by steering practices where lenders and realtors were steering Black people into certain neighborhoods based on their race and steering them into certain types of housing also based on race. And so you had, on top of all of that, more discriminatory lending practices that include charging higher rent interest and coming up with fees that were only being charged to minority borrowers. And that also, again, limits the opportunity that Blacks and other minority groups have when it comes to being able to purchase homes. So there's a lot going on in terms of all of the barriers to Black home ownership. Some particular nuances in Washington state is that there is a lack of affordable housing options, and that's not only in Washington state, but I'm going to talk about things that affect your state, particularly in urban areas like Seattle and Tacoma. There has been just this rising cost of living that's made it difficult for people to find affordable housing. We have the impact of gentrification. So we're seeing property values and rental prices rise in certain neighborhoods that causes people who've lived there for a long time, people of color in particular, to be displaced because they can't afford it anymore. Then other factors are lack of tenant protection. So currently, Washington state doesn't have as strong of tenant protections as in other states, and that makes it hard for renters to be able to get stable and affordable housing. And then you've got restrictive zoning laws that limit where and when new housing can be built. And that also causes issues when it comes to affordability in housing. And then other things related to discrimination in housing policy and practice is around families and children. There was a study done in 2010 where it was found that families with children were regularly turned away from rental properties, and that violates your state and federal fair housing laws. In addition to that, we saw that there was discrimination related to particularly King County, where there was unlawful discrimination against renters with housing vouchers. So that, again, you see this discrimination. So if people have lower income and they need these vouchers, there are certain landlords that are saying, no, you can't live here, or we won't accept those vouchers. And then we also saw discrimination against people who have disabilities. So landlords not willing to make the accommodations necessary for people with disabilities to be able to live in their properties, which again violates state and federal law. And as you can see, these things were happening in 2010, 2016, 2018. So it's not that this was 50 years ago. These are happening fairly current day issues. Other factors related are that minorities in King County were more likely to be denied mortgages than those white applicants, even when they had similar credit scores. So that was in 2019. And again, in recent years, we're seeing that this discrimination in the housing market persists in Washington state. And then when it comes to homeless people, that we saw that in Seattle in particular, there was a denying of homeless individuals access to emergency shelter. And I think oftentimes when we talk about the mortgage crisis or the housing crisis, we don't always think of homeless people as top of mind, but they also need a place to live. And if they're being denied access to shelters, that's a serious issue as well. So, question for you again, you can answer this in the chat, but what do you think the average difference in annual household income is between Black and white households in Washington state? Is it $10,000, $18,000, $26,000, or $33,000? All right. Good amount of split between C and D. The answer is actually C. It is $26,000. Data from the 2020 census showed that for white households in Washington, the average income is $79,000, while the median income for Black households is $53,000 and Hispanic households is $59,000. So again, that economic disparity also makes it difficult to pass on wealth, makes it more difficult to acquire a home and receive funding for that. On top of that, we see that poverty is another factor. The poverty rate for Black and Hispanic residents is nearly twice as high as it is for white residents. And then we know that the home ownership rate is significantly lower for Black and Hispanic residents compared to white. I don't know if you can see this graph really well, but the top line is the home ownership rate for white people in the United States from 1993 through 2021. And you can see it's significantly higher. The bottom line is Black people in the US, and the one above that, the darker line, is for Hispanic people. And so there's a huge gap, and this data, it's consistently been that way for all of those years. So how do we address this crisis? What do we need to do? So some of the things that have already been done is in the area of fair housing and education outreach. So that includes people educating the public on various housing providers about their rights and responsibilities. In Washington state, you have the Washington State Human Rights Commission that actively provides housing education and outreach to help its citizens, particularly, really for anyone, but it's available to Black homeowners or those seeking home ownership to really understand what the fair housing practices are and who should be complying to those laws in the state. Additionally, there's fair housing enforcement. So that includes investigating and prosecuting complaints. In Washington state, the Washington State Human Rights Commission is the organization that does that. They are responsible for investigating and resolving housing complaints of discrimination. They provide mediation and conciliation and hearings and take legal action if necessary. So making sure that the Black community is aware of that when it comes to securing housing. Having inclusive zoning and land use policies is an important piece of this. And the Washington State's Growth Management Act encourages the development of affordable and accessible housing. So making sure that the community is aware of that as well. Washington State has also taken steps to increase access to credit and home ownership through the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, and they provide funding and programs to help increase affordable housing, affordable mortgage financing and down payment assistance, as well as providing homebuyer education for minority and low-income households. Then there is support from fair housing organizations. So Washington State Housing Finance Commission is another organization that is out there fighting this good fight in terms of fair housing. They are actively working to dismantle structural racism when it comes to the housing industry. Then you have the local governments and organizations and individuals who are working throughout the state to help create inclusive and welcoming cultures in the community. They're promoting cultural awareness. They're talking about ways to be culturally competent, to encourage inclusion and collaboration around DEI and around housing. One of the ways that this is done is through landlord incentive programs. So there are state and local government tax incentives that are being given to landlords to encourage them to rent to low-income families. And then monitoring and enforcing compliance with the laws, making sure through the state's attorney's office that renters are providing housing that is free from discrimination, eviction, and any other kinds of housing insecurity. So there are a lot of things being done from the state level and the community level already in Washington state, as well as throughout the government. So the big piece is making sure people are educated and aware of what is available to them. One of the interesting things that I found was that there are so many claims and so many issues that there aren't enough people to keep up with all of the actions that need to be taken. So that is one piece that's slowing down some of these issues being addressed in the Black community, but folks are aware of it. It just needs more people working on the issue. So that's why it's important for Black people to engage in this from a community perspective, because it takes not only the government and not only the community, but it takes individuals to engage as well. James Baldwin said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." So to that end, I want to share a few things that the community has worked on for itself. And one is education and awareness. So people are working on providing more seminars, more literature, more webinars to help people increase their understanding of fair housing law and to make people aware of what resources are out there and to talk about fair housing rights. Another piece is just organizing and advocacy. We see Black communities in Washington state, as well as across the country, organizing and advocating for all kinds of policies and practices that need to be changed so that community members can have access to affordable housing. We see, even in Wisconsin, we see more builders who are specifically looking at areas where they can build more affordable housing. African-American building companies and architects and people are getting involved in this from a grassroots level and starting companies to actually address this particular issue. So making sure that we're advocating for the inclusive zoning and getting involved in land use policy, which is something that a lot of people don't know a lot about and up to this point might not have been interested, might not have seen the connection of all the dots. But now, because of advocacy, more people are getting involved, and that's part of the Black resistance movement on that level. Additionally, we're seeing more folks get involved in housing education. For Washington state, the Black community has more programs to talk about access and more services for education and counseling around the home buying process, around credit repair and financial management to help people budget and be able to save and have access to other resources when it comes to this whole process of buying a home. On top of that, we're seeing increases when it comes to access to credit. So there are initiatives and programs that are helping people to have more affordable mortgage financing and down payment assistance. And this is happening in Black communities as well as Hispanic communities and the community at large. But in those communities that are really suffering through this crisis, folks are trying to learn more about how to improve credit. And there are creative programs that are coming up to help folks get access to down payments. One of them is the Green Line Housing Foundation, and it's in California, which is your neighboring state. But the founder is Jasmine Schupper. And she says one of the greatest accumulators of wealth occurs through real estate that is passed down from generation to generation. And the wealth from the appreciation of those assets is often what funds future real estate purchases, education, and businesses. And this we know is true. I know you know this as realtors, that this is a very true statement. She is a realtor, was pursuing a career in real estate when she became aware of the magnitude of the Black housing crisis and started this foundation to address that need. The Green Line Housing Foundation provides down payment grants, home maintenance grants, and financial education to qualified people of color to help restore justice as God intended it, one home at a time. So her organization is actually a faith-based organization, and this is one of the Black resistance strategies. It's not just people from state and local government. It's faith-based, it's community-based, it's neighbor to neighbor, getting in there, family member to family member, helping people to get home ownership. And what they do is there's an application process where they are educating people along the way and then qualifying them for grants for down payments to get housing. So it's a really great program. But that's an example. I know there are programs similar to that in Washington State and other places across the country, but it's a great example of a strategy to address this home ownership crisis. Additionally, supporting Black-owned businesses and developers is a way to address this too. Black communities in Washington State and beyond have been supporting the development and preservation of Black-owned businesses and housing developments. And doing that is important because it sustains the Black economy. It provides jobs and economic opportunities and helps increase the supply of affordable housing. When we have businesses that are successful, we're providing stability for those folks to be able to go out and invest in housing, and they are in turn supporting others in the community. And then making sure from a political representation perspective that we are being thoughtful about who we elect and put in office. Black community leaders in Washington State and beyond are encouraging the community strongly to participate in local politics and elect representatives who will prioritize the needs of the Black community. We are seeing that across the country. Record numbers of Black and Hispanic and other underrepresented folks are getting into the political arena and really pressing legislators and pressing the community to stay involved, but addressing issues that are critical to our communities. And so when we talk about Black resistance, this piece around representation is crucially important for us to be involved and address those needs. Another strategy is around community land trusts. So Black communities in Washington State have supported the establishment of community land trusts. So making sure that these are in place to provide permanent, affordable housing, as well as green spaces like gardens and parks and other community assets. So the more we can get involved in that process, the better. And that also requires education and awareness. And then eighth is renters' rights. The Black community in Washington State has supported initiatives that protect renters from discrimination, eviction, and other forms of housing. And that, again, is a key factor for folks to be involved in. Home ownership for sure is important, but just having housing security from a tenant's rights perspective is also crucial to have happen in the Black community. Some additional resources that you may be aware of is the Seattle Office of Civil Rights. They also do a lot of education around fair housing, and they outreach to promote understanding in the community around fair housing, and also get involved to make sure that people are being compliant when it comes to legislation in that space. Another resource is Sound Generations. They're a leading nonprofit in Washington State, and they provide support for low-income and minority seniors when it comes to housing assistance as well as homeowner education. Then you have the Seattle-King County NAACP, which is working, of course, on a wide range of issues related to African Americans, but also particularly on housing issues. And we also have the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle. They are involved heavily in employment issues, in building wealth, but also in housing and home ownership programs. Habitat for Humanity of Seattle-King County also is a big organization that works towards providing affordable housing for Black and minority people there in the King County area. So where I want to just end up pressing upon you with importance is, as you can see, the issue is huge. It's aptly named a crisis because of the disparity that is growing deeper and deeper. There are many factors that contribute to the housing crisis, and at the same time, there are many people working on the crisis. So it's a multi-pronged approach. It comes from local, state, and federal government. It comes from community organizations that are secular and faith-based, and it comes from each individual getting involved. It comes from businesses, large and small, and entrepreneurship, Black entrepreneurship that is trying to address the issue. And as I said, individual awareness and some individual accountability when it comes to credit scores and just good, sound financial practices. And the strategies and resources that we have are not mutually exclusive. They have to be used in combination to get the best results. So everyone has to be in here thinking about the ways that we can create equity in home ownership, not just for the Black community, but for everyone. And so we're looking at ways that we can implement all of these strategies and come up with even more innovative ways to meet the community's needs and use the resources we have. And know that it's going to take all of us working together in order to have equitable housing for everyone. So at this time, I'd like to open up the floor for discussion because I'd like to hear from your perspective. What do you see as some of the problems from a Black home ownership perspective, and how maybe have you or others that you know worked to address the issue? So if you want to raise your hand or put something in the chat, that is great. Or if you have questions for me, feel free to ask those as well. Okay, so Corey, go ahead and unmute and ask your question or make your comment.
So it's more of a comment. I heard you mention the Seattle Urban League, but I actually work in partnership with the Tacoma Urban League, and we pretty much do similar work. We do have a home buyer class that's focused on helping more BIPOC homeowners. We also have a home maintenance class, which is a partnership between several organizations here in the Pierce County area. And what we do is try to empower homeowners to stay in their home through doing their own home repairs and know when to call a professional. So each month we pick a topic, and then homeowners know to come to us. And that we find is just helping, because there's so many investors that have been preying on Pierce County, and especially BIPOC, the homes that are handed down and don't know how to do repairs. And so that's the work that we're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that, because there is, I think, a perception that because the home maintenance and home repair, home renovation industry is booming, that people know how to do that work. And a lot of us, including myself, do not. So I appreciate that the Urban League, where you are in Tacoma, is engaged in that. And there are a lot of others who are doing that too. So thank you for sharing that. Any other comments or questions? Jordan.
Hi, yes. I've had the privilege of working with a lot of first-time home buyers, that are of color. And I think the one thing that I get a lot when being reached out to is them just genuinely being afraid, like fearful and not knowing where to start. And many of them come in with a mindset of like, they already think that they're not even going to be able to afford anything in Washington at all. So they're like, I'll just continue to rent forever. But I think if we continue to find ways to make the conversation more comfortable for Black and Brown people and create environments for them to come and learn and be more open to the possibility of them being able to qualify for a home, I think that'd be great. And just coming up with ways to get out into communities even more, not just like meetups or you know, marketing for self, but more community based stuff of like come and learn and be open, and you don't have to feel the pressure of like not being able to afford in Washington, because the people that I have helped, they more than could afford when they thought that their chances were slim to none.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that too. My cousin, she's in Illinois, but she works with single mothers, and one of the courses that they run in their organization is I think it's a year-long course specifically for single moms to get them from rental to home ownership. And so they are taking classes. They're doing just what you said. And she walks them through step by step what the process is and what they need to do to repair credit if that's an issue, how to fill out the paperwork. They meet with lenders and they do a whole cycle of education process. And then she connects them with realtors who will particularly look at their specific needs in terms of what their home ownership requirements are, and then pairs them and finds them homes within their budgets. And she actually goes with them every step of the way through the application process for funding all the way to closing. And she's helped, I don't know, in the last probably 2 or 3 years, probably 50 different women be able to get home. So it's really been a great program that they've run. So thank you. Desda.
Thank you so much for this conversation, for your willingness to have it with us, and for Washington Realtors for putting it on. Really, really great. I love statistics, and I think they're so important to help our lawmakers understand the disparity that they just really have no idea about. So thank you for that. I took a picture of every single slide, and I'm going to use it as much as possible. But my question is, we are new to DEI in Washington, and specifically Spokane. We just now started a DEI community, or excuse me, a committee at our local Realtor Association. And my question is to the group maybe, but also to you, Ms. Biddle, will be, what would have our minority communities feel welcome to show up and participate to something? Is it okay for us to, like, I'm having all these thoughts and ideas about what I could possibly do with my lender friends about holding first-time homebuyer courses exclusively for our African-American community in Spokane, or, it's so hard to know what is okay, but like, I'm interested of feedback on what would have our communities feeling comfortable in it, like what Jordan shared about a safe space where they can ask questions and not feel judged or, have that concern.
Yeah, I'll let other people answer when I've finished too. But thoughts that come to mind are making sure that the people who are hosting this have a good reputation in the community already, that they're trustworthy folks. Going to them as opposed to having them come to you. So if you're appealing to perhaps apartment dwellers, maybe having those courses in an apartment community room or somewhere in their community that's already familiar to them, instead of having them go elsewhere. Thinking about things like childcare, and if it's in the evening, providing a meal. A lot of times people won't be able to go to, something during the day. So probably an evening or a weekend is going to be better. Having some familiar faces advocate or, say that this is a good thing, and partnering with faith-based organizations with churches, community organizations, sponsoring, co-sponsoring the events with maybe the Black sororities and fraternities that might be in your area, or I know there's a gospel announcers guild that is in I think there's one in Tacoma and somewhere else out there. But looking for organizations that people are already familiar with and trust to partner with them to have these courses, I think would be helpful. If you could reach people through the school districts, that would be another way to get there. But I think it's really about relationship, building that trust, and then having these classes at times and in spaces that remove some of the barriers. So if transportation is an issue, maybe getting a shuttle bus or giving people a bus pass or Uber gift certificate or something to get them there, and making sure you feed them and have childcare. Other thoughts from everybody else?
There's a great comment in the chat from, never know how to pronounce her name. Is it Deneve Ramirez?
It's Dynavi.
Dynavi, yes. She commented, the approach to the BIPOC realtor communities need to be culturally sensitive. With communities of color and or communities of cultural representation truly matters. Part of the issue is retention of Black realtors. Everyone speaks English, but not everyone speaks Black culture.
Yeah, that's true. So if you can partner with someone of color, that would always also be helpful. And I think, one of the things, an obvious thing in terms of outreach would be figuring out ways to get more people of color into the real estate industry. And I don't know, not a realtor, so I don't know all of the process for that. I know there are classes and licensing and all that has to happen, but is there a pathway that you can create to open more doors to the realty or real estate industry for people that you could be working on? Other comments? Someone says here, Chris says, I like to do casual Q&As at local hangouts to make it approachable to attend, for focusing on first-time home buyers and DPA programs. I try to partner with different lenders each time, currently broadening my referral network to include more diversity. That's a great idea. I've seen a couple of folks in different communities I've been a part of. Doing them with church communities has been really successful. If there are churches who would let you hold something on a regular night that they might already be meeting, or after a church service on Sunday, that might be a good way to do it too. And if there's a particular coffee shop or a restaurant or something like that that you could partner with to do some kind of an informational session, that would be great as well. What do you find in your own dealings with people of color, Black and brown or otherwise, who are struggling in the home buying process? What are the biggest barriers that you see?
Me personally?
Sure.
Or anybody?
Anybody, but you can start.
I would agree with what Jordan said. My experience is really a lack of knowledge and experience, and a fear of looking stupid, really, that they have never had anybody to like break it down for them, to help them know exactly where to start. And that it's like any other goal, right? You just take the big thing and you break it down into small bites that you can actually manage. And a lot of hand-holding, right? Like a lot of back and forth with, my lender just called me and said a bunch of stuff, and I have no idea, right, what that means. And then calling the lender and getting that information, and then kind of breaking it down in a simpler way that would have somebody who doesn't know the lingo around what we're doing, just to make sure that they understand all the things and that they're making smart, informed decisions. But definitely, we have such a small community of minorities in Spokane that I would imagine our disparities are maybe grandly different.
Anybody else have? Thank you, Desda. Anybody else have experience?
I have a quick one that kind of goes along with it. A lot of my black and brown fires that are looking, especially in the Seattle area, that want to stay in the Seattle area, a lot of them also don't qualify for what their needs are in those areas because of gentrification. They've been pushed out. So they don't want to leave the area, so they'd rather rent and stay in the area than own a home themselves. So that's another thing that's like, I'm not sure how we figure out that issue or like how we bring up. I know the grant programs and things like that are starting to help people to help people afford in their areas, but that is one thing that they're facing.
Yeah, and that's a tough one. And important for people to get involved with the zoning, and also if we can get more people of color who are actually owning some of these buildings who are sympathetic around that issue, I think that would be helpful. But that's a tough one, and that's a nationwide issue too. Someone put in here Corey put in here, Tacoma Urban League is hosting an event with Windmere to help more people of color in the industry, to help get more people in the industry, and that we will have a BIPOC panel and we'll announce a scholarship. That's cool. I love that. What else? Denny.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So just a couple things. There's a few of us who are on Seattle King County Realtors, our Association of Realtors, who have created some relationships with some of the local high schools. And the idea is to introduce the students to careers related to real estate, again, as a way to open their minds to inviting those who have interest, even anything from architecture to inspections and appraisals, just to try to increase the number of individuals in the BIPOC communities to consider these careers. So we've had a couple of meetings and they've been successful, and the questions are always wonderful from the students. And then I did upload a link in the chat that has to do with reparations, and I recognize that that's an interesting topic, that I have relatives from the Bay Area who started a program, and it's they're just starting out, but they partnered up with individuals, BIPOC communities, and I think they've started in the Chicago area, and they're looking at not only home ownership, but entrepreneurship and education. And I'll just invite people, if there's an interest, to take a look at the link and see if anything resonates. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Yes, they are. There's a community in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago, that has already started issuing checks for reparations and face a whole lot of controversy, but they're doing it and trying to make inroads in that way. So that's important. And important. I love the idea of working with high school students. Are you doing internships with them, or how do you get them involved?
Well, Windermere has a program working with, actually it's college students, but right now, just with respect to the high schools, we're working with like the counseling, those who are in the counseling centers. And it's really just kind of an open forum. We've created panels and just to invite the students. I don't know if there's any sort of shadowing or internships, but that does sound like, the logical next step. And I'd be happy to get back with anybody who has more questions about what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's great. I know there's a conglomeration of Century 21 agencies here in the Midwest. They are in, well, it's weird. They're in Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Florida. So I don't know how that works, but they are actually piloting some programs to get more people of color involved in real estate. So I'm not sure how far they've gotten, but for the last couple of years, they've been developing a way to spark some interest. So they've been partnering with different organizations, but they're also trying to do some internships to get more people involved in the real estate industry. So the more of that we can do, the better. Job fairs would be great. Someone put that in here. And Haley says less than 1% of the population in her area is Black. It's primarily Hispanic. I imagine it can be even more difficult for people of color in my community facing these issues. I know of a lending program for Native Americans. It would be great to have something for Black people in my area as well. I think, yeah, for sure. But I think looking at your geographic domain, wherever you are, and just looking at the numbers and saying to yourself, okay, who is here? Who is, based on the census data, you can find out what the demographics are of your particular city, county, area. And from there, you can ask yourself, okay, so if we only have 1% Black and 5% Hispanic or 7% Indigenous people, what percentage of those folks are actually homeowners? And then from there, see what's the gap, what are the issues they're facing, and address it all the way around. I think we're talking about this issue for Black History Month because the disparity is the greatest for Black people, but there's disparities probably in many different ethnic or racial demographics. So whatever we can do based on our particular region of the country or the region of the state that we're in, I think would be important to address. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, I am going to turn it back. Okay, wait. I've got a comment from Desda that says, why aren't there African-American home loans available? The Native loans are incredibly easy and great to work with. Makes sense that this would certainly increase Black ownership. That's a great question, Desda. I do not know the answer.
Who do we talk to, Deborah?
Talk to HUD, I think. All right, Corey has a hand raised.
I was actually going to answer that question. I sit on various panels and we have explored it, but the issue that we keep running into is how do you get around fair housing? And so we're trying to figure out, I understand HUD 184 is a great program, but it's, like I said, it's just trying to get around the fair housing complaints that would be received.
Thank you for that additional insight.
So the answer is the same as the Native loans, which is offering an incentive to one group is not a disparity to any other group, right? It doesn't take away from other races being able to obtain home loans.
For us, but other people, like I said, we've had challenges. We have a state senator on the panel that we've been talking to, and overcoming that has been a challenge.
Refer. All right, well, I'm going to turn it back over to Liz. I thank you for spending the time today to talk about this important issue. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it will take all of our creative minds and hard work to make a difference in this.
Definitely. Yep. Thank you so much, Deborah, for the presentation and for this very open and timely discussion, and for everybody that participated in today's webinar. I appreciate it. I will send everybody who participated today the webinar recording and some other resources that Washington Realtors has that can help with the discussion today.
I'll send you the slide deck and you can send that out to people.
Oh, okay, perfect. That'd be awesome. All right.
Right. Great.
All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day and take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.